A.W. Tozer, a great American pastor, an author, says this. He wrote, "One of the most important things about you is what you think about God." Pretty sure I just butchered that statement, but that just kind of paraphrase him for a second. What you believe about God is the most important thing about you. If you and I were kind of having a one-on-one conversation, we were sharing a cup of coffee, probably not sharing a cup of coffee, but sharing coffee together, and I were to ask you to finish this sentence, God is, I'm really curious as to how you would fill in the blank. I'm sure there would be all different kinds of answers that would be shared. God is, and then you would fill in the blank. Some of you would just put in one simple word. Pretty sure I just heard someone say good. Someone would say holy. You might say righteous. You might say perfect. For some of you, you might use kind of more descriptive phrases. God is the one that I go to on a daily basis. God is the one who sent his son Jesus Christ to die for my sin. God is the one who holds all things together. And you would kind of describe God in these types of personal phrases. And I would dare say that probably some of you here, or maybe if you're watching online, you would describe God in a negative sense. Maybe you would say God is not fair. God is not real. God let me down. God allowed me to go through a situation that was really painful, that was really tough. And so you would kind of describe God that way. Now here's the thing. What we think about God really is the greatest thing about us. Because ideas have consequences, don't they? Ideas have consequences. Think about it. The way you think about money kind of has consequences in your life, in your spending habits. The way you think about work has consequences in your daily grind of 9 to 5. What you think about politics, right? It affects certain decisions and the way that you kind of view the world around you. So our ideas aren't just these things that exist in a vacuum in our mind, but our ideas and our thoughts actually have consequences in our life. So all I'm saying is this. It's very important how we finish the sentence, God is. Because it has consequences in our life. It has consequences in our attitude. It has consequences in our action. Now, here's my promise to you. My commitment is not to stand before you week after week all summer long and give you Andy's opinion of who God is. We've got something better. We have his word. And what God has done in his word is he has actually revealed himself to us. We call this a revelation. It is the active, ongoing revealing of God to us through his word. And so when we read Exodus, we're going to get to see God personally interact with his people, his chosen people, the nation of Israel. And we're going to get to actually very clearly define exactly who God is. Not so that we can go out in the world and say, hey, I know who God is, but so that it actually affects and influences our action, because what we believe has consequences. Now, today, as we kind of dive into Exodus 1, there's a question that we're going to answer. It's a common question. Maybe it's a question you've asked. Maybe it's a question you've heard other people ask. But the question is this. Why do bad things happen to good people? Anybody here familiar with this question? You've heard this question before? Just a quick show of hands. Just want to make sure. All right. Pretty much everybody in the room. All right. Look, we're not the only one who's ever asked that question. You're not the only one who's ever asked that question. Like, this is the question that has been around since the beginning of time, really. I truly believe it. Why do bad things happen to good people? Now, we're going to look at Exodus 1, and I think we're going to get a little bit of clarity on this answer. Maybe you've wrestled with this question before, and God has given you clarity on it. Maybe you are wrestling with this question right now because you look around the world and you see someone that's going through a really hard time. And so let's kind of look at Exodus 1. But before we do, I want to talk about the question for a second. Because let's be honest, if you ask a bad question, what happens? You can get some bad answers, right? Questions can be faulty. Now, we're going to address this question to the best that we can from Exodus 1. But on the surface, I just want to say there's some assumptions that are made when any person asks, why do bad things happen to good people? There's one of two assumptions, or both. One assumption is, I deserve better. Right? Think about it. Why do bad things happen to good people? Our assumption is, I'm the good person, and I deserve better than a flat tire. Our assumption is, my mom is a good person. She deserves better than to be diagnosed with cancer. Our assumption is, my dad is a good person, and so he deserves better than to be laid off from his job. So when we ask the question, why do bad things happen to good people? We're making a very bold assumption. I deserve better than this. Just a quick question. Says who? Says who? Says us? That would be like me going to the Supreme Court of the United States of America saying, I declare I no longer have to pay taxes. I could do that. But the Supreme Court would look at me and say, says who? Says Andy Comer, pastor of Antioch, Georgetown Church. By what standard? By what authority? By what sovereignty? So you see what I'm saying? So when we say I deserve better, by whose standard? By our standard? Or by God's perfect and holy standard? So there's an assumption that's made. The second assumption that's made is it's God's fault. It's God's fault. Why do bad things happen to good people? A lot of times the question is asked like this: why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? So what do we do with the blame? What do we do with the responsibility? We shift it away from sin, right? And we put it on to God. God, you're the one to blame. Can I just remind us all of something before we jump in? When God created the earth, he created it good. He created it perfect. Did you know when God created the earth, he created it without death, without sorrow, without sadness, without thorns, without mosquitoes? Man, that would have been a fabulous place. Oh, so good. He created it good. He created it perfect. And so when we go, why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? We're putting the blame on him. We're pointing the finger at him instead of pointing the finger to original sin. So when we ask the question, look, I've spent too much time on this, but we're making two very big and bold assumptions. Here's what we're going to learn about God today. And you're like, Andy, when are we going to read the Bible? All right, we're about there. Here's what we need to know about God today. God is sovereign. God is sovereign. The word sovereign, maybe you're not familiar with that word. It's not really a churchy word. It's actually, kind of a government word, a word that describes the rule and authority that a person has. Sovereign simply means I'm in control. Turn to your neighbor and say, sovereign means I'm in control. So when we say that God is sovereign, all we're saying is, we're going to use this word a lot, all we're saying today is that God is in control. It means this. It means he doesn't have to answer to anybody. Isn't that good? It means that God stands alone. He's not accountable to anybody else. He stands alone, and he can make the call, and he can make the judgment. If you were to ask me, Andy, what's your favorite color? That's a sovereign decision for me. I get to decide what my favorite color is. If you were to ask me, Andy, what color are you going to paint your living room? That's not a sovereign decision. Right? There's someone in our household I'm going to be accountable to. Right? So I'm going to share in that decision. Basically, I'm going to let her decide. That's not a sovereign decision. If we were to ask our family, hey, where are you going on vacation? I could make the sovereign decision and say, hey, this is where we're going. But it's not a sovereign decision because I want to go somewhere that our entire family would enjoy. And so to be completely sovereign, I want you to think about it, means you don't have to answer to anybody. You stand alone and you are in complete control. What we're going to see in Exodus 1 is God is in complete control, even though there's going to be some challenging things that kind of happen to God's people, the Israelites. All right, here we go. I know you're ready for it. Exodus 1, starting in verse 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob Each came with his family. Now, I just want to make sure they're all on the same page. If you're not familiar with the Bible, that's okay. We'll kind of bring you along. I want to clarify, Jacob and Israel are the same guy, all right? God changes Jacob's name to Israel, and so when the Bible is referring to Israel as a person, it's talking about Jacob as his name change. But most of the time, it's going to refer to Israel as a people, as a family, as a nation. Just kind of give you the quick backstory. Abraham has Isaac, has Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons, and then it kind of goes on to describe his family here. These are these 12 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. There's 4. Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin. There's 5, 6, and 7. Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. That's 8, 9, 10, 11. We're missing one. I'm glad you asked, because look at verse 5. The total number of Jacob's descendants was 70. Joseph was already in Egypt. Remember Joseph? Joseph was the favorite child, the favorite son. He's the one that Jacob gives the coat of many colors, and it makes all of his brothers jealous, and so they sell him off into slavery, and he ends up in this little place called Egypt. Now, this is important. Egypt is not the promised land. Is it a beautiful area? Absolutely. Is it the promised land? No. Just north of Egypt, even modern-day Egypt, there's a little place called Israel. It's actually where Israel lives and dwells even today. But this was the land that God had given his people for possession. But listen, I want you to see in God's sovereignty, he allows Israel, he allows his family to be brought down into Egypt. Why? Because there was a famine in the land. And Joseph, even though he had all these his life was like a roller coaster, wasn't it? He's like up and down and up and down. And so he ends up as second in command only to Pharaoh in Egypt. He provides for the people by storing up food because God reveals to him that a famine is coming. And so God allows him to bring his family. And so Egypt becomes like an incubator for the nation of Israel. They become like a womb. What does the baby do in a mother's womb? He grows. She grows. Why does God bring the family of Abraham down to Egypt? So they can grow. So they can multiply. Because remember the promise that God made to Abram in Genesis 15? He said, I'll make your descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky. Now, at that point in Genesis 15, guess how many make up the nation of Israel? Abraham, Sarah. You got 2. You ever seen how many stars? Now look at this picture. Look at this. I mean, you see in the background, like the star, there's too many to count. So somehow God has to grow this nation from 2 to too many to count. And how many are there here in Exodus chapter 1? There's 70. Progress, but we still got a long way to go, right? Well, what happens next? Joseph and all his brothers in that generation eventually died, but the Israelites were fruitful, increased rapidly, multiplied, and became extremely numerous so that the land was filled with them. Here's what I want you to see about God's sovereignty. God is sovereign in the situation. You with me on this? We're going to look at 3 levels of God's sovereignty. If you're looking at a map, we're going to get up and close real tight, then we're going to kind of step back and we're going to see the big picture. But first, let's see, God is sovereign in the situation. It is not by accident that Israel, the nation of Israel, is living in Egypt. This was God's plan. Because God is sovereign in the situation. God is sovereign in the details. God is in control of the small things. And you might be wondering, why didn't God just allow them to live in the land that he promised them? Why bring them down to Egypt? Well, there was another group of people. Actually, there were several groups of people living in the promised land. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Jebusites, the Cellulites, the bright lights, the dim lights, all these different ites are living in the land. And God knows. God can see into the future, even the futures that don't actually happen. He can see the potential future. And God knows if he allows his people to stay in the promised land, they're going to intermarry with all these ites. God's racist. No. He knows as they intermarry and as they begin to intermingle, they're going to have next generation of kids, and these kids are going to grow up thinking, well, my dad worships this God and my mom worships this God. What do I do? And so God wants to reveal himself through this nation, and so he pulls them out of an area where they would intermingle and not grow to be like the stars of the sky. So he brings them down to Egypt as an incubator. So all I want to say is, look, God is sovereign in the situation. This is God's plan for the nation of Israel. This is comforting for us because you may be in a situation, you're like, I don't like this. Can I just whisper something to you for a second? God is sovereign in the situation. He's sovereign over your street address. He's sovereign over how many kids you have. He's sovereign over where you work. He's sovereign over what city you call home. God is sovereign over the details. Now, let's continue reading verse 8. A new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt, and he said to his people, look, the Israelites, people are more numerous and they're more powerful than we are. Come, let's deal shrewdly with them. Uh-oh. Otherwise, here's what will happen. They will multiply further, and when war breaks out, they'll join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country. So the Egyptians assigned taskmasters over the Israelites to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as supply cities for Pharaoh. Listen, God's in the details, right? He's sovereign over the situation, and so he moves his people down to Egypt where they can grow and flourish and multiply, and that's happening. But then it almost seems like Pharaoh is kind of making his chess move. Because what does he see? He sees a threat, doesn't he? Uh-oh, they're growing faster than we are. They're having babies left and right. So he's doing the mental math. If they continue at this pace, one day they're going to be larger than we are. And what happens when our enemy comes and attacks and we have a nation living with us that's bigger than we are? Like, this is a threat. They can't be having this many babies. I got an idea. Let's put them to work. They must be bored. They must be bored at home. There's nothing else to do, so they just make babies. I'll put them to work. And we'll use them to build cities. Uh-oh. Seems like God's plan is going to be thwarted, right? Well, let's read on in verse 12. But the more they oppressed them, the more they multiplied. I love that. If there's ever a verse that says you can't stop God's plan, like this is it, right? Like the harder they tried to limit the baby factory, what happened? The more they multiplied. The more they oppressed them, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. I love this. The Pharaoh, king of Egypt, he's like, let's slow the spread. And God's like, no, I've got a plan here. You're not going to slow down the spread of my people multiplying. Can I tell you something else about God's sovereignty? God is sovereign in the seasons. He's sovereign over the situation. Again, we're on the map. We're going to back up a little bit. He's not just sovereign over like the small little details where he's like, I wonder what detail is going to happen next. I wonder what chess move someone's going to make. And then I'm going to make another chess move. And I'm going to make another chess move. No. God's sovereign over the seasons. Did you know that God, he called it? Don't you love it when someone calls it? I do this every now and then, playing basketball, kind of get it half court. I'm like, all right, nothing but net. And you just shoot it. It's like rim or air ball, and you just kind of get laughed at for a second. But when you call it and it goes in, you're like, there it is. There it is, right there, right? You know what God never misses? If you're playing, you would love to have him on your basketball team, right? He never misses. He calls it. I'm going to read from Genesis chapter 15, verse 13. The Lord said to Abram, this is back when he tells him, I'm going to take you from two to too many to count. He says this, know this for certain. Like you can be sure of it, Abraham. Your offspring will be resident aliens for 400 years in a land that does not belong to them and will be enslaved and oppressed. When he tells him this, Abraham's living in the promised land. It's not his yet. He doesn't have the deed yet. But God tells him he brought him here. In Abraham's mind, we'll just grow right here. And God says, no, your descendants are going to spend 400 years in a land that does not belong to them, and they're going to be enslaved, and they're going to be oppressed. God called it. And guess how long Israel lived as slaves and under oppression in Egypt. Anybody want to take a stab at it? 400 years. Smack dab. 400 years. He calls it. He's sovereign over the seasons. Here's the thing about seasons. Seasons come and go, don't they? I'll put it like this. Seasons have an expiration date. Aren't you glad it's not winter forever? Unless you live in Antarctica, I guess. But aren't you glad it's not like winter? There's an expiration. There's an end date. Summer, we're in Texas. This is going to be good. It has an end date, doesn't it? The heat doesn't go on forever. Seasons come and seasons go. God is sovereign over the seasons. Listen, you may be in a season right now in your life of hardship. You may be in a season of it feels like oppression. You may be in a season of pain. You may be in a season of suffering. Can I just whisper some encouragement to you? The season doesn't last forever. Now, you might be thinking, Andy, can you really say that to people? What if that goes on for the rest of their lives? Because some of these people that were living in the season, they were born in slavery and died in slavery. But listen, it still ended. Look, this flesh and this blood and this world, it's not the end. So even if the expiration date of a season of suffering is death itself, it doesn't go on forever. When we have a relationship with God through his son, Jesus Christ, suffering does come to an end. And God is building and preparing us for eternity, a place of peace and rest and comfort all over again. So I want you to know, look, God is sovereign over the seasons, that even this oppression was coming to an end. Let's read on in verse 15. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, all right, so now he's going to take the plan and he's going to advance it another level. The first, whose name was Shiphrah, and the second, whose name was Puah. Here's what he says. When you help the Hebrew women, that's the Israelite, these Jews, when you help the women give birth, observe them as they deliver. If the child is a son, kill him. But if it's a daughter, she may live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live. Let me tell you a third kind of final thing about God's sovereignty. God is sovereign in the story. He's sovereign in the situation. He's sovereign in the season, but he's also sovereign over the big story. Here's what, let's kind of hang out with me just for a second. Let's take a big step back, all right, out of Egypt, out of Israel, and let's get a big picture of what God's doing. Remember when he created Adam and Eve in the garden, it was perfect, and they sinned? It means that God gave Adam and Eve a choice. He gave them a free will. I want you to think about it. People always want to ask, why did God put that tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, why would he put that there? He had to put it there so that his people, his creation could have a choice. Because if Adam and Eve are created and the only choice is obedience, there's no free will in that, right? It's kind of like me telling my daughters, hey, what do you want for lunch? We got peanut butter and jelly. Dad, I want peanut butter and honey. Nope, sorry, we got peanut butter and jelly. You get one choice. What do you want, sweetie? There's no free will when you only have one option. And so God, because he loves his creation, and he didn't create robots, but he wants to give them free will, he puts this tree there and says, you get to decide now to either walk in obedience or disobedience. And what do? They disobeyed God. They said, we're not really going to trust you. We're going to believe a snake, and we're going to look at this fruit, and it looks really tasty and good and moist, and God, you must be keeping something from us. We don't know if we can trust you. And they ate of it, and what happened? Death and destruction and decay came into the world. And God tells Eve, and he tells the serpent, look, there's through man's seed, a Savior's going to come, I'm paraphrasing, and he's going to crush Satan's head. This is good news. This is fantastic news. Because God is sovereign in the story. He has a redemption plan to defeat sin and death and restore the right relationship between us and God. Let me repeat that, all right? He has a redemption plan to defeat sin and death and restore the right relationship between us and God. Now, if you're Satan, you're the serpent, all right? You hear the promise that you're going to be defeated. Your head's going to get crushed one day. You know God's plan. What's Satan's plan? What's his plan? I'll tell you what his plan is. Try to stop God's plan. Because if God's plan is carried out, guess what? That's not good news for Satan. And here's the thing about Satan. He has no creative plan whatsoever. He cannot create it. His only plan is, I got to try to stop God's plan. So what's God's plan? It's through a seed. It's through humanity. So what's his plan? Well, I'm going to stop it. So what does he do right off the bat? Adam and Eve have Cain and Abel. I believe it was under satanic influence, under satanic evil, that he whispers to Cain, why don't you kill your brother? What's he trying to do? He's trying to cut off that seed. But God was sovereign in the story because the Messiah wasn't coming through Abel, it was coming through Seth, the brother. God is sovereign in the story. Here, I think Pharaoh is under satanic influence. Hey, why don't you kill all the males? Why would he want that? He's trying to stop the two from going to too many. Let's just cut it off. I don't want a savior to be born from man's seed that's going to crush my head. So let's kill him. But God is sovereign in the story. And Shiphrah and Puah, they feared God. By the way, love the name Puah. If you ever have a kid, name her Puah. I think it means beautiful or something really interesting like that. Sorry, just got sidetracked. So God is sovereign in the story. And it happens later. Remember when the Magi come and visit King Herod and they're looking for the Savior, and what does Herod do after they leave? He puts out a decree. I believe this is under satanic evil influence. Let's kill all the boys, all the male children 2 years and younger. That's Satan trying to stop the Savior from being born. We know that Jesus was born. We know that he comes into the world. And so what does Satan do? He tries to kill him. And I think as Jesus was hanging there on the cross, I think Satan was over here having a little party thinking, yes, finally did it. He just didn't know God's story that would take place and be carried out on day 3. In fact, later on, because Jesus doesn't say, all right, I'm going back to heaven, that's it. Hope the world figures it out. What does he? He says, no, I'm coming back again. And I'm going to rule and I'm going to reign. Satan knows this. And so right about the time that Israel is starting to be formed right as a nation again, we see that satanic evil influence all over again, this time through a pawn named Hitler. Let's eradicate all Jews. That's evil. Downright satanic evil. But listen, God is sovereign in the story. We want to ask the question, why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? Listen, it's not his fault. Death and destruction don't come from him. It comes from our decision to rebel against him and to turn away from him. And it's God's sovereign, it's in his sovereignty, it's in his own authority, it's in his own rule and reign that he would actually provide and make a way for us to be restored back into a right relationship with him. He is sovereign over the situation, he is sovereign over the season, and he is sovereign even over the big story. There is nothing outside of God's sovereignty. There is not a single molecule that runs rogue or hides outside of God being aware of it. Down to the very smallest thing. And there's not a planet or a galaxy that God did not speak into existence. He is sovereign. So if you're asking that question, I want to leave you with this thought. Here it is. God is not the cause of evil, but God is in control of evil. He's not the cause. He's the exact opposite. But he is in control. And Exodus 1 shows us that no matter what happens to God's people, he is perfectly carrying out his plan. Can I speak to your life for a second? No matter what it is that's going on in your life personally, I want you to know and be encouraged today, God is sovereign. He's in control. I don't know what it is that may be going on in your family, but I want you to know that God is sovereign and He's in control. Listen, there's some pretty incredible things happening in our church. And I firmly believe that God is sovereign and He is in control. We get a lot of questions about what's happening next. Last week you mentioned about 4 services. What does that look like? And what about building? When's the land? And all these different things. And look, I wish God would just give us the full roadmap, but He doesn't. He just gives us the next step. And so we move forward taking steps, knowing and believing that God is sovereign and He's in control of the work He's doing in our church. Let me kind of hit home for a second. Just to remind you, God is sovereign in our nation. There's things that happen that we're like, I didn't want it to happen that way, and things like that. But look, He's sovereign. He's in control. His plan has not been thwarted. He's carrying it out perfectly. And on the grand scheme of things that are happening around the world and around the globe, there's not an earthquake that happens. There's not a tsunami that happens. There's not anything in the world that happens that God is not in control of. Not the cause of, but certainly, definitely in control of.